They said she'd never walk again. The doctors gave up. Her father bought everything but faith. And then, a nanny whispered 3 words that changed everything. They said money could move mountains. But in the house that sat above Greenwood Hill, money had built only walls. The Cross Mansion was the kind of place you read about in magazines. 10,000 square feet of glass, steel, and silence. The home of Richard Cross, industrial magnate, philanthropist, billionaire, the kind of man whose name opened doors and silenced rooms. To the world, Richard was success made flesh, the perfect example of what ambition could create. But inside those crystal walls, something sacred was broken. Upstairs, behind the last door on the left, sat his only daughter, Amelia Grace Cross, in a wheelchair too big for her frame. 8 years old, frail, beautiful, and born into a world she could not walk through. She was sunlight trapped in a cage of stillness. The doctors called it a rare neuromuscular disorder, a cruel misfire of the body that refused to obey its own commands. Her legs were there, perfect in shape, soft as porcelain, but lifeless. And for years, her father tried everything. From Harvard to Geneva, from stem cell pioneers to neurological specialists, he threw money at the universe, demanding a miracle, bargaining with science. But each trip ended the same way, doctors shaking their heads, papers folded neatly, and the same sentence echoing through sterile hospital corridors. She may never walk. Richard always walked out before they finished the sentence. He couldn't bear the word never. To a man who built an empire out of pure will, never sounded like surrender. He became a ghost in his own home, working longer hours, buying bigger things, surrounding himself with more success he couldn't feel. But the one thing he couldn't fix was the silence between him and his daughter. Because when you live in denial long enough, love starts to sound like guilt. The mornings were mechanical. The nurses would lift Amelia from her bed, dress her in silk, and place her by the window overlooking the garden. From there, she'd watch the other children from town play near the estate fence, running, chasing, falling, laughing. She'd press her small hand against the cold glass and whisper to herself, "Maybe tomorrow." But tomorrow always looked the same. Her world was confined to polished floors, careful hands, and pitying smiles. Every nurse spoke softly, as if volume could break her. Every therapist promised progress that never came. And when the pain of another failed attempt became too much, she'd simply close her eyes and imagine what grass might feel like between her toes. Then came the summer that changed everything. It started with loss. The head nurse resigned, the physiotherapist relocated, and Richard, in a fit of quiet rage, dissolved the entire caregiving team. He couldn't bear the pattern anymore, people promising miracles and delivering disappointment. So he called an agency, one that specialized in long-term caretakers. The woman they sent wasn't who he expected. Evelyn Hart, 36, calm eyes, dark hair tied in a low bun, and a presence that felt unshakably human. She didn't wear perfume or designer shoes. Just a simple gray sweater and a look that said she had seen life and survived it. Richard met her in the grand living room, standing beside the piano that hadn't been played in years. He glanced at her resume, unimpressed. No high-level medical degree, no prestigious references, just 10 years of experience as a private caregiver and a note that said, "Former school teacher." He looked up and said, "This job isn't easy." She simply replied, "Neither is being alive." Something in her tone silenced him. He didn't know it then, but that woman would become the only miracle money could never buy. From the moment Evelyn met Amelia, The mansion's rhythm changed. She didn't tiptoe around the girl's condition. She didn't coo or whisper or treat her like glass. She simply sat beside her, cross-legged on the floor, and said, "Tell me what you love." Amelia blinked. No one had ever asked her that. People asked about symptoms, progress, or comfort, not dreams. That night, for the first time in years, Amelia laughed. A sound so small yet so contagious it startled the staff. By the end of the week, she was spending less time staring out the window and more time talking about clouds, music, and how she'd memorized every bird that landed near her window. Evelyn didn't bring new equipment or treatments. She brought something subtler, hope disguised as normalcy. She'd read to Amelia for hours, not medical books or fairy tales, but stories about courage, real ones, about people who defied odds, about hearts that healed what the world said was broken. And then, one morning, she began something strange. Evelyn entered Amelia's room before sunrise, sunlight barely spilling through the curtains. She knelt beside the bed and said softly, "Let's feel the world today." She gently placed Amelia's bare feet on the carpet. The girl tensed instantly, not from pain, but from habit. Years of fear, years of being told what she couldn't do. But Evelyn didn't ask her to move. She just said, "Close your eyes, feel the ground." Minutes passed, no movement, only breathing. That became their ritual. Every morning, 10 minutes of quiet stillness, feet on the floor, heart in awareness. And every time, Evelyn would whisper 3 words like a prayer: feel, don't fear. The first week, it looked pointless. The second week, something shifted. A tiny twitch in Amelia's toes, like a spark in a dead wire. By the third week, that spark became warmth. The mansion began to notice. The nurses whispered about it over coffee. The housekeepers left the door ajar, pretending to dust longer than necessary. They saw something they couldn't explain. A child who once cried through every therapy session, now smiling, humming, alive. But the man who couldn't believe in miracles didn't notice. Richard was too buried in meetings, too afraid of disappointment to witness the very thing he'd prayed for. When he finally walked into his daughter's room one afternoon and saw Evelyn kneeling beside her, hands on her legs, whispering something softly, his instinct was anger. He didn't understand the stillness, the simplicity of what she was doing. He thought she was wasting time. He thought she was giving false hope. But hope, when planted in the right soil, grows in silence. Days stretched into months. Summer melted into autumn, and with each sunrise, Amelia grew braver. Evelyn stopped measuring progress in inches or minutes. She measured it in spirit. The lift of Amelia's shoulders, the spark in her laughter, the steadiness of her gaze. And then, one golden afternoon, it happened. The light was pouring in through the windows, painting the room in honey and amber. Evelyn guided Amelia's hands to the edge of the bed and said, "Let's breathe." The girl inhaled slowly. Her legs trembled as she pressed her feet against the floor. 1 heartbeat, 2, then movement, a fragile, uncertain rise. Her knees shook, her breath caught, but she was standing. No doctors, no machines, no applause. Just a girl and her faith, balancing between fear and freedom. Evelyn's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. She knew that too much emotion could break the moment. For nearly a minute, Amelia stood. And when she finally fell back onto the bed, she wasn't crying. She was laughing. The sound echoed through the mansion. For once, it wasn't pity. It was life. The next morning, Evelyn kept the secret. She didn't tell Richard, because she knew. Miracles die under pressure. Instead, she let Amelia lead. Every day the girl stood a little longer, her balance improving, her confidence growing. But Richard eventually noticed. He came home early one evening, the sound of laughter spilling from the upstairs hall. He paused, frowning, then walked quietly toward it. Through the slightly open door, he saw his daughter, standing. Unsteady, trembling, but standing. And for a brief, fragile second, awe filled his eyes. Then fear replaced it. He stepped in, breaking the silence. The magic collapsed. Amelia fell back into her chair, startled. That night, the house turned cold again. He called Evelyn to his study, his voice low, his tone cutting. He accused her of playing with his daughter's mind, of giving false hope, of doing what doctors had warned against. Evelyn stood still, unshaken. She didn't argue. She simply looked him in the eyes. And in that silence, he saw something that terrified him more than failure. He saw truth. The truth that maybe she was right. Maybe his empire of control was built on fear. And this woman, this quiet, stubborn woman, had dared to challenge it. He dismissed her from the room, but her presence lingered, like light that refuses to die after sunset. That night, as storms rolled over Greenwood Hill, Amelia sat awake, whispering the words Evelyn had taught her. Feel, don't fear. Over and over, until the thunder outside began to sound like applause. The storm passed, but something inside that mansion never quite settled again. Evelyn's quiet defiance had left a mark that neither fear nor money could erase. The next morning, Richard left early for the city, buried beneath his routines, drowning in work that no longer fulfilled him. But upstairs, Amelia's world continued to change. Without permission, without schedule, just change. Every dawn, before the staff stirred, Evelyn entered Amelia's room like a soft breath. The first light brushed the curtains, and the world was still asleep. She'd place Amelia's feet on the rug and whisper those same 3 words. Feel, don't fear. It wasn't magic. It was repetition, a rhythm between the heart and the impossible. Sometimes Amelia trembled. Sometimes she wept quietly. But Evelyn never rushed her. She understood something science often forgot, that healing is not about forcing the body. It's about freeing it from memory. Days became ritual. Amelia began to greet the morning not with dread, but with expectancy. She'd ask to be lifted onto the floor earlier, wanting to feel the earth's weight again. The carpet beneath her toes was no longer foreign. It was familiar, a battlefield she was beginning to claim. Evelyn guided her through breathing, visualization, awareness. She'd say, "The body listens to the mind when the mind listens to love." And slowly, that love, that unseen force, began to awaken something buried deep inside the girl. The tremors in her legs turned to motion. The stiffness gave way to rhythm. The silence between breaths became music. No one else noticed. Not yet. But Evelyn did. And she protected that progress like a secret flame in the wind. Richard returned one night unexpectedly early. The house was half lit, quiet, except for a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter. His daughter's laughter. He followed it, hesitant, drawn by something his logic couldn't explain. Through the hallway, past portraits of his ancestors, through the open door. And there, he saw it. Amelia standing, barefoot, shaking, yes, but upright, alive, radiant. For the first time, he saw her face not as fragile, but fierce. He wanted to speak, to say something, to ask how. But his voice betrayed him. In his chest, awe wrestled with fear. Because this wasn't supposed to be possible. He'd accepted her limitation as reality. And when you've lived long enough inside control, miracles look like rebellion. He left the doorway without a word, and that silence, that failure to speak, would soon cost him dearly. The next morning, the mansion felt colder. Richard avoided eye contact. The air between him and Evelyn was thick with tension. But Evelyn didn't retreat. She understood his fear. It wasn't anger. It was the terror of losing the only narrative he'd ever known, that power solves everything. Yet here was proof that power couldn't explain what love could heal. So she continued, quietly, patiently, consistently. Because true change doesn't ask for permission. Weeks passed. Amelia began taking her first steps between the window and her bed. At first, 2 steps, then 3, then 5. The world seemed to hold its breath every time she moved. The staff, though instructed not to interfere, couldn't help themselves. They watched in awe, whispering prayers under their breath as the child they'd once pitied became a symbol of hope. But Evelyn refused to let the story become a spectacle. She knew how fragile progress could be, so she shielded Amelia from cameras, from curiosity, from the temptation of fame. The only person she couldn't shield her from was her father. Richard Cross was a man divided. Half of him was still the ruthless businessman, rational, pragmatic, logical. The other half was the father, wounded, humbled, yearning. He spent nights in his office replaying what he'd seen. The image of Amelia standing replayed in his mind like a haunting melody. He told no one. Not his board, not his assistants. He couldn't bring himself to believe it. Not yet. Instead, he buried himself deeper into work, as if productivity could protect him from vulnerability. But work no longer satisfied. Because every time he sat in a meeting or read a report, his mind drifted back to that moment. His daughter's trembling knees, her whisper of determination. He envied her courage. He feared her freedom. Because once she proved the impossible wrong, what else in his life was he pretending couldn't change? Winter came, blanketing Greenwood Hill in silence. Evelyn used that stillness as training. The sessions grew longer, the exercises harder. She made Amelia feel snow on her skin, bare feet on cold marble, breath visible in the air. She taught her not to run from discomfort, but to befriend it. "Pain is not punishment," she'd say quietly. "It's proof you're alive." And Amelia learned, not just to move, but to exist beyond fear. Every step became a conversation between her courage and her past. One afternoon, as snowflakes drifted beyond the window, Evelyn brought a mirror into the room. She placed it across from Amelia and said nothing. For a moment, the child stared, uncertain. Then slowly she stood. For the first time she saw herself upright, not broken, not helpless, not confined, whole. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not of sadness but recognition. Because deep down she'd always believed she could. She just needed someone to whisper the permission, and that's what Evelyn had done, given her back permission to believe. But joy has enemies. And in the Cross Mansion, fear was still the loudest of them all. News of Amelia's progress leaked. It started with a careless conversation, a nurse at a market, a journalist listening. Within days, whispers spread. The billionaire's daughter is walking. Miracle recovery in Greenwood. New therapy defies medicine. By the end of the week, reporters lined the gates. Drones hovered over the estate. Tabloids called it the Cross Miracle. And Richard, ever the strategist, saw opportunity. He didn't mean harm. He simply didn't understand the sacredness of what had happened. To him, this was hope reborn, a story to share, to market, to control. He summoned his legal team. He called documentary producers. He began shaping the narrative before even asking his daughter what she wanted. Evelyn tried to stop him. She warned him that pressure would destroy what patience had built. But Richard's ego was louder than her warning. He wanted to prove to the world and to himself that he had conquered the impossible. And so, The mansion once again filled with cameras, microphones, lights. Amelia's quiet sanctuary became a stage. At first, she smiled for the pictures, confused, nervous, unsure. But as the lights flashed, her eyes searched for Evelyn. Evelyn stood behind the cameras, her expression unreadable, sorrow hidden behind calm. Because she knew. Miracles are fragile, and the world doesn't know how to hold fragile things. The next morning, Evelyn was gone. She left before sunrise, no goodbye, no explanation, only a note on Amelia's nightstand. Walk for yourself, not for the world. When Richard found the note, he was furious. He saw betrayal, not wisdom. He accused her of abandoning his daughter when she was most needed. But Amelia didn't see it that way. She wept, not because Evelyn left, but because she understood why. Evelyn had always taught her that true healing is freedom, and freedom sometimes means letting go of the hand that guided you. Time passed. The cameras faded. The journalists moved on. But Evelyn's absence left a hollow ache in both Amelia and her father. The girl continued her exercises, but something had changed. Without Evelyn's quiet strength, the sessions felt mechanical. The words, "feel, don't fear," echoed in her memory, but they sounded distant now, like a song half forgotten. Richard tried to fill the silence. He hired new therapists, new doctors, new motivators. But none of them understood her like Evelyn did. They spoke in measurements and milestones. Evelyn had spoken in meaning, and meaning, once lost, takes time to find again. Months rolled into a cold spring. Amelia grew stronger, yes, but not just in body, in spirit. She learned to walk small distances on her own, to navigate the halls with quiet grace. But grief lingered. She often looked out the window at the path Evelyn used to walk each morning. The garden still held her presence, in the wind, in the warmth, in the silence that followed her memory. Richard watched his daughter from a distance. He didn't know how to apologize. Not for the cameras, not for the control, not for the pride that had blinded him. So he said nothing. Instead, he built more, bought more, donated more. He mistook guilt for generosity. But love is never built from transactions. It's built from truth. And truth, for the first time in his life, was about to break him. It happened on a quiet evening in May. Richard was on his way home from the city when his phone rang. A voice on the other end trembled. "Sir, it's about Evelyn." There had been a car crash, a wet road, a curve too sharp. She didn't survive. The world fell silent. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just sat in the back of his car, eyes fixed on nothing. The driver said nothing either. Some silences are too heavy to share. When he arrived home, the mansion felt colder than ever. He walked past the grand piano, past the portraits, past the noise of wealth, until he reached Amelia's room. She was sitting by the window, holding the note Evelyn had left her. Her face was dry, calm, almost peaceful. Because deep down, she already knew. Somehow she had felt it. The wind that morning had sounded different, softer, but sad. When she looked at her father, she didn't cry. She simply said, "She's still here." And in that moment, he understood what he had missed all along. Evelyn hadn't just healed his daughter's legs. She had healed her soul. Days turned to weeks. The house prepared for the funeral. Reporters came again, but this time Richard said no. No press. No coverage, no spectacle. He owed Evelyn more than that. He owed her silence, respect, gratitude. The service was small, just family, staff, and a few from the town. But one person wasn't there. Amelia. She had locked herself in her room, refusing to be carried to the car. Richard knocked, pleaded, reasoned. Nothing. Until finally, through the door, he heard her whisper. The same 3 words Evelyn had once taught her. Feel. Don't fear. That whisper would change everything. Grief has its own gravity. It takes the world you know and bends it towards silence. In the days after the news of Evelyn's death, the great house on Greenwood Hill seemed to tilt toward a hush that nothing could brighten. The staff moved gently, as though sound itself might break something delicate. The curtains stayed half-drawn, and even the clock sounded apologetic when they dared to speak. Yet within the smallest room, Amelia's room, something else began to assemble itself from the stillness. Not a miracle in the cinematic sense, not the loud thunder of the impossible, but the quiet shape of a choice. Everything that had mattered now lived inside those 3 words Evelyn left behind. The mansion had been a museum of restraint. Now it became a chapel of remembrance. The bed, the wheelchair, the window, the carpet, witnesses to an apprenticeship in courage. Loss had arrived like winter, and with it a strange clarity. Love had never been measured by proximity, and strength had never been measured by volume. The one who whispered was gone. The whisper remained. The funeral day approached as an appointment the heart wanted to cancel, but grief keeps its dates. In the morning, the sky wore a color that was not quite blue and not quite gray, as if it, too, hesitated. The car waited at the entrance. The program, the printed order of farewell, lay on a table beside white lilies that tried and failed to sweeten the ache in the air. The mansion staff gathered with the sober competence of people who had known both opulence and sorrow. Richard Cross, who had once arranged the world with money and relentless will, found himself helpless before a door he could not open, the door to his daughter's room. A father learns late that love cannot be negotiated, it can only be witnessed. Inside that room, the child considered distance. It was not measured in yards, but in years. Years of being carried, years of being pitied, years of learning that fear sits in the body, like an old tenant who assumes the lease is permanent. Across from the bed, the carpet waited like a field at dawn. The mirror Evelyn had brought still leaned against the wall. In it, the girl could see not a perfect body, but a true one. And truth, once seen, becomes a promise you either keep or betray. The whisper rose again, not from a mouth this time, but from memory. Feel, don't fear. She placed her feet on the edge of the world, the woven threshold where many mornings had begun, and let the first breath expand until it reached the parts of her that still believed in injury more than in possibility. The body is a ledger. It records every attempt, every fall, every learned caution. But love is an eraser. Slowly, she closed her eyes and wrote a new line across the page. Outside her room, time waited. The day was a long hallway with one necessary door, and beyond it the chapel, and beyond that, the ground. Somewhere under that ground, the earth would receive what the world had refused to hold gently enough. But before the day could demand its ritual, an unwitnessed ritual completed itself. The girl stood. Not with the theatrical suddenness of legend, but with the muscular logic of every small practice that had preceded it. Knees that remembered trembling met the air with a steadier tone. Hips learned the slope of courage. Ankles negotiated balance with the patience of artisans. Breath gathered its flock. There is a moment in every crossing when the mind must decide whether the unknown is an enemy. She had reached that moment 1,000 times in practice. Now, she reached it in truth. Feel. Don't fear. The first step arrived like a letter that had taken years to reach her address. The second step arrived with the answer she had always wanted, but had not dared to request out loud. The third step was less step than belonging, as if the floor finally recognized its rightful conversation partner. By the fourth, the room that had once been an archive of disappointed mornings turned into the beginning of a road. The hallway received her without applause. The staff looked up and did not cry out. Reverence held their reactions at the threshold of sound. 100 small prayers happened in a single collective breath. The child crossed the stretch of carpet to wood, wood to stone, stone to the top of the stair. Each transition asked a new question. Will you trust me here? Each time she answered by continuing. At the staircase, memory tried its final negotiation. Injury is persuasive. It speaks in the grammar of history. But she was no longer speaking that language. She placed one hand upon the banister, not for rescue, but for rhythm, felt the cold grain like a signature from the tree it used to be, and allowed her weight to travel from future to present, from fear to feeling. Down she went, one step, then the next, and then a sequence, and then the simple fact of descent. The bottom of the stairs arrived not with triumph, but with peace, the upgrade from surviving to living. At the front door, light greeted her like a story she had heard as a child and finally understood as her own. The chauffeur moved to lift her as he had done for years, but the new mathematics no longer solved in that direction. The car, the sky, the lilies, the paper program, everything waited on a decision that had already been made. She crossed the last yards to the car with the careful authority of someone who has negotiated for their own life and won. The chapel was the color of forgiveness. It held grief with practiced hands. People from town who had known Evelyn not as a headline but as a neighbor filled the benches with shoulders close enough to share burdens. The staff took their places, the organ chose a voice that would not intrude, and the air agreed to carry what words could not. At the front, a portrait, the kind of photograph that knows it is unworthy of the person it represents. A candle on either side learned patience from its own flame. When the girl entered, the room did not gasp. It learned. It learned what courage looks like when it stops hiding. She did not take the aisle as a runway, nor as a miracle on display, but as a road between two countries, the one where she was carried and the one where she chose. The steps made no announcement. They only made new ground. Halfway down, grief met her, not as a wall, but as a companion. They walked together to the front. The words spoken at the service tried to be adequate. They assembled Evelyn in anecdotes and kindness and ordinary proofs of extraordinary character, the quiet generosities, the steadfast presence, the way she made time feel less hostile. But the most accurate eulogy stood before the portrait, a child who had learned how to become her own permission. Somewhere between him and benediction, the shape of inheritance revealed itself. Money inherits property. Love inherits courage. One can be counted. The other must be lived. After the service, the procession moved toward the small burial ground behind the chapel, where stones practice memory and grass practices return. The sky held back its rain the way a face holds back tears until the right time. The final ritual began, and with it, the final letting go. A life that had been an argument for gentleness came to rest. The shovel's blunt liturgy spoke in careful thuds. The child did not collapse. She had already fallen years ago into the arms of someone who taught her how to rise. Today, she stood. Grief, when honored, does not paralyze. It mobilizes. On the drive back, the city in the distance made promises it could not keep, and the mansion on the hill made requests it no longer needed to make. Within those walls, a father looked at a daughter and understood with the suddenness of real comprehension that he had mistaken spectacle for salvation. He had thought the world must see to make her progress real. He now saw that reality requires no audience. The cameras could not have helped. The lights would only have bleached what love had colored in. Change does not apologize for arriving late. That evening, the billionaire called in no advisors. He did not summon marketing teams or lawyers or the machinery of presentation. He sat alone in the room where his ambition had spent itself for years and measured cost not in dollars, but in distances. The distance between the man who believed control was safety and the father who now knew surrender was strength. The distance between the headline he had once wanted and the legacy he now understood. In the ledger of the soul, he moved a number from one column to another. The balance changed. The next day broke with a conviction that did not require permission. The house became a workshop. Architects came not to crown a name in steel, but to carve a promise in stone. There would be a center, not a monument to a billionaire's redemption arc, but a home for children who had been told that never was their address. The Evelyn Hart Center for Children of Courage would not sell hope. It would steward it. No cameras at intake, no test results on billboards, only the daily, ordinary heroism of repetition, breath, balance, belief. The motto would not be a slogan. It would be the sentence that had rearranged a life. Feel, don't fear. Money, humbled, made itself useful, not as a trumpet, but as a tool. Scholarships were established for families who could not afford a long fight with an indifferent system. A fund appeared for caregivers, because the world forgets that the hands which heal also need holding. Research fellowships were created for scientists willing to study the border where psychology and neurology shake hands. A quiet network formed between therapists, teachers, mentors, a community not organized around pity, but around potential. The blueprints turned into hallways, the hallways turned into rooms, the rooms turned into beginnings. Meanwhile, a smaller revolution continued in the house, unadvertised. The morning practice resumed, now led by the one who had once followed. Amelia, still young enough to learn and old enough to teach, became both student and steward. She woke not to be lifted, but to decide. She walked not to impress, but to inhabit. Some days the pain returned like an old acquaintance who refuses to understand boundaries. She negotiated without surrender. Some days the strength arrived early and stayed late. She spent it generously. Over weeks the distances grew. The garden, a landscape once viewed through glass, became a geography of firsts. First step on grass, first walk to the fence, first turn around the oak, first run that was not yet a run but felt like one. The wind, which had been a spectator, became a collaborator. The town watched with the kind of admiration that keeps its hands folded. Gossip, which feeds on envy, had no appetite here. Respect is quiet. Children at the park near the estate's fence learned a new game. How slowly they could walk together, how attentively they could place their feet, how carefully they could breathe, imitating a bravery they could not name. Parents found that courage was contagious. Teachers noticed posture changing not only in bodies, but in attitudes. The community did not just celebrate a miracle. It practiced one. When the center opened its doors, the first families entered with fear disguised as practicality. They brought folders full of paperwork and hearts heavy with the long weight of bureaucracy. They did not ask for a miracle. They asked for rest from disappointment. What they received was a language, a way to speak to the body without threatening it, a way to persuade the mind without shaming it, a way to let time be a partner instead of a judge. The work was simple and therefore difficult. Grace is rarely complex, but it asks for everything. In its first months, the center refused press. Stories found their way out not in headlines, but in thank you notes, in kitchen table testimonies, in the new sound of laughter in houses that had not heard it in years. A girl who had learned to cross her living room without panic. A boy who found he could stand from a chair without negotiating with terror. A parent who discovered that their love was enough to begin again, every day. The center did not promise recovery. It promised relationship, with breath, with balance, with the truth that fear need not be the loudest voice in the room. Back on Greenwood Hill, the mansion repurposed itself further. The grand piano, silent for years, found a curious new student. Music had waited for feet to become fluent enough to move pedals, for hands to rest in a confidence that did not apologize. Lessons began. Scales learned patience, arpeggios learned mercy, and melody learned to live with the broken and the brave. The first time music filled the house again, the portraits on the wall seemed less ceremonial. More human, ancestors listening to a future they could not have imagined. For the father, the lesson arrived in installments, the way Grace prefers to teach. He learned that apology is not a press release, it is a daily practice. He learned that his daughter did not need him to be invincible, she needed him to be present. He learned that his power, so celebrated in the world he once worshipped, was finally useful only when it knelt. And he learned that legacy is not a building, though buildings can help. Legacy is a sentence you give to the next person who reaches the edge of themselves. Feel, don't fear. The city eventually asked for a story. Documentaries appeared again, proposals slick with sincerity. This time, the answer was different. If the story must be told, it would be told without the spectacle, no staged heroics, no before and after trophies. It would be told in the voices of those who had learned to speak softly to themselves. It would be told in the shape of a room where a child's feet first touched a carpet and learned to negotiate with the ground. When the film was finally made, it was not a triumphal march. It was a liturgy of ordinary courage. People left theaters not applauding, but breathing differently. Seasons rounded the calendar and returned to themselves. Spring came back with its ambitious flowers. The oak outside the garden discovered new rings. The center found its rhythm. The mansion kept its humbler posture. And the child who had once lived at a window now walked pathways that had not existed until she stepped on them. Strength is the kind of wealth that increases as it is spent. She spent it on others. She volunteered at the center with the kind of authority only the healed can exercise, not command, but companionship. On the anniversary of Evelyn's passing, the chapel's bell remembered its work. A small gathering returned to the ground that had received her, not with the heaviness of that first day, but with the warmth of gratitude that has done its homework. Flowers bent in the slight breeze. The names on the stones listened. The child, no longer quite a child, stood without assistance at the place where love had taught its hardest lesson. She brought no speech. She offered no dramatic gesture. She simply stood and embodied amen to a life that had whispered the right words at the right time. The walk back to the car was unremarkable. That was the point. What had once been a miracle was now an errand. What had once demanded a film score now proceeded at the volume of everyday life. The world's appetite for spectacle never learns. The heart's appetite for meaning always does. The two rarely dine together. On Greenwood Hill, meaning won. In the years that followed, the center's waiting room filled with names that would never make headlines, but deserved them. Some children ran by summer, some stood by Christmas. Some learned to inhabit their wheelchairs with a dignity that refused shame, discovering that walking was not the only synonym for freedom. The sentence did its work in hundreds of grammars. Feel, don't fear. It lowered the shoulders of parents who had lived too long under verdicts. It lifted the chins of children who had learned to count their limits before their blessings. It found its way into school assemblies, into quiet prayers, into the notes taped to bathroom mirrors. Courage, like kindness, knows how to travel. The billionaire aged into someone you might not recognize if you only met his press clippings. He spoke less. He listened more. Money still moved, but its traffic pattern changed, out, toward the edges where need lives. He discovered an arithmetic that Wall Street had never taught him: subtraction as salvation, generosity as multiplication, humility as compound interest. The rooms that had once displayed trophies now displayed letters from families with handwriting that tilted uphill with hope. There remained always days when fear made a persuasive case, days when pain returned to collect its taxes. But taxes are not rent. The body no longer leased to fear. On those days, the practice reasserted itself with the quiet stubbornness that had built everything: breath, feet, balance, the room, the mirror, the whisper: feel, don't fear. A person does not graduate from this sentence. They become fluent in it. Years later, when the question arrived, the one a younger version of the father had asked the world and the world had refused to answer, the answer finally fit in a human mouth. What is power? Not control, not money, not the capacity to arrange other people's lives like furniture in a room you own. Power is the permission you give another soul to believe in itself. Power is a sentence on the right day. Power is a hand you offer, and then remove when they are ready to stand alone. The story, if it must be summarized for those in a hurry, is this: once there was a child whom the world sentenced to stillness. Once there was a man who mistook influence for love. Once there was a woman who knew the address of courage and mailed it in 3 words. The twist was not that the child walked. The twist was that everyone else learned how. And the lesson, if it must be carved above a door, is simple enough that a child can memorize it, and an empire can be remade by it. Some people build empires to prove their power. But the greatest power isn't in wealth, science, or fame. It is in whispering the right words, at the right moment, to a soul that forgot it could stand. Feel, don't fear. If this story moved something in you, if you felt Evelyn's whisper, feel, don't fear, somewhere deep inside your own life, then don't just click away. Pause. Ask yourself, what's the fear you've been living with? What dream have you paralyzed because someone told you you never would? Let this story remind you, your miracle might just be waiting for you to feel, not fear. So before you go, tell me in the comments, what part of this story hit you the hardest, and why? Your words could be the whisper someone else needs today. And if you believe in stories that heal, stories that wake the soul, subscribe to Hidden Tales Stories, because here, every story is a mirror of the human heart. Like this video to help it reach someone who's lost their strength. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that no pain is final.